The morning after the funeral, Eleanor Marsh made herself a single cup of tea. Not two. Not the way she had for 40 years, his with milk, hers plain. Both sitting on the kitchen counter until the steam curled away and they carried them wordlessly to the table and sat across from each other in the particular silence that belongs only to people who no longer need to fill every quiet with sound. Just one cup. Hers. Plain. She stood at the window while she drank it, watching the neighbor's dog cross the yard with the unhurried confidence of something that had no idea the world had changed. The sky was that pale, uncertain gray that comes after rain, not beautiful, not ugly, just present. Like the house around her. Like the chair still slightly pulled out from his side of the table. She hadn't pushed it back in yet. She wasn't sure she would. People had said the usual things in the days leading up to this one. He lived a good life. He wasn't in pain. You were together so long, that's a gift, Eleanor. And she had nodded at all of it because nodding was the only motion she could manage that didn't require her to locate words. Nodding meant she was still listening. Still here. But here, alone on a Tuesday morning with one cup of tea and 40 years of shared silence pressing against her like weather. Eleanor understood something that no one standing in a funeral parlor ever quite says out loud: being left is its own kind of grief. Not better. Not worse. Just entirely its own. Bernard Marsh had never been a man who spoke about money. He spoke about weather, about the evening news, about whether the tomatoes in the garden were coming in too early or just right. He had opinions about cricket and strong ones about poorly made bread. But money, the practical, necessary, quietly anxious business of it, was something he carried the way certain men carry their worries, internally, without ceremony. And apparently without ever fully sharing the map. So when the solicitor, a young man named Gerald Finch who wore his suit a half-size too large and apologized for everything twice, sat across from Eleanor 3 weeks after Bernard's death and began explaining the contents of what he called the estate, she had no particular frame of reference against which to measure what she was hearing. She heard it anyway. The savings account she knew about, modest, responsible, the product of decades of careful living, had been largely absorbed by Bernard's final medical costs. The long private treatment he'd insisted on without ever burdening her with the numbers behind it. There was the house, of course, which was hers. The car. The furniture. His tools in the garage, which no one would want except perhaps the neighbor's eldest son, who had once admired the hand plane and might again. And then Gerald Finch said, with the careful tone of someone delivering news they have rehearsed, that there was a complication. Not in the legal sense, everything was in order, the will was clean, Bernard had seen to that with characteristic precision. But it appeared, according to the records Gerald had been working through, that at some point Bernard had made certain financial arrangements that were separate from the accounts she knew about. Not hidden, exactly. Just, unfiled. Untold. He had a second solicitor, Gerald said, and then immediately apologized for how that sounded. Not, there's nothing improper. He simply, it seems your husband maintained a separate account, a separate set of documents, with an older firm. The gentleman who managed those affairs retired some years ago, and the file was transferred but it didn't surface until we began looking. Eleanor set down her teacup. She looked at Gerald Finch's too large suit and his earnest, uncomfortable face, and she felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not anger. Not surprise, exactly. Something older than both. Something that tasted, faintly, like of course. Because Bernard had always been doing something she couldn't quite see. Something behind the surface of ordinary life, quiet as a river under ice. What does the file contain? She asked. Gerald hesitated. That's the part one need you to understand, he said. The file contains a deed. She waited. A property deed. For a house. He paused again, looking at his hands, then at her. In a village called Brinsham, about 40 miles north. The deed is in your husband's name. It's been there, that is, he's owned it, for approximately. He checked his notes, though she suspected he already knew. 31 years. The kitchen was quiet. The neighbor's dog barked once, somewhere distant. Eleanor looked out the window. 31 years. A house. 40 miles north, in a village she had never heard Bernard mention, and Bernard, who had driven her everywhere across their married life. Who had commented on properties they passed and roads that changed and villages they stopped in for petrol or sandwiches, Bernard had never once said the name Brincham. She thought about that. She thought about it very carefully. And she did not, in that moment, feel betrayed. She felt curious. Which was, in its own way, more unsettling. She didn't go immediately. That was the first thing she decided without quite deciding it. She went home instead and made soup from whatever was in the refrigerator, leek and potato, the kind that requires no recipe. Just attention, and she ate it standing at the counter because sitting at the table still felt like something that needed to be earned back gradually. She looked at the chair. She looked at the window. She thought about a house 40 miles north that she had never heard of. She went to bed and did not sleep for a long time. What she did instead was remember. She remembered Bernard at 32, the year they married. Standing in the registry office with that particular look he had when he was trying not to smile too fully, as though joy were something to be rationed in public. She remembered his hands. He had hands that looked as though they'd been designed for making things, wide and deliberate, even though he'd spent his working life as an accountant. She'd always thought that was the mild tragedy of him, that he had builder's hands and a desk job, and the two things had never quite reconciled. She remembered the year they'd tried to buy a cottage in Wales, early in the marriage, when having a second place still felt like something people like them might manage. The deal had fallen through on a planning technicality, and Bernard had been disappointed in a way he didn't name, just quietly carried for a few weeks before setting it down. She had forgotten about that. She hadn't thought of it in decades. She thought of it now. She drove to Brincham on a Thursday, in the grey and yellow light of an October morning. With Gerald Finch's printed directions on the passenger seat because she didn't trust herself to follow a voice from her phone without getting distracted by the wrong thing. She drove the way she'd always driven when Bernard wasn't in the car, slightly slower than necessary, taking the longer routes through villages rather than the faster A roads, noticing things. Brincham was small. Not picturesque in the way that draws visitors, just genuinely small, a post office, a pub called the Farrier. A church with a lopsided spire that looked as though it had been leaning slightly into the wind for so long it had forgotten what upright felt like. The house was on a lane called Medlar Row, which Eleanor had to drive past twice before she found it. Because the lane was barely wider than her car and the sign was half hidden by a hawthorn that had been allowed to grow in its own direction without interference. She pulled in. She sat in the car. It was a small stone house. 1 story, or perhaps 1.5, there was a dormer window in the roof that suggested an attic room. The garden was overgrown but not destroyed, the kind of overgrown that takes years and carries within it the ghost of something once tended. There was a climbing rose along the front wall, still holding 2 or 3 late blooms, deep red, the color of something that refuses to quit. She had a key. Gerald had given it to her in a small brown envelope. She sat in the car for 11 minutes before she used it. The door opened on a hallway that smelled of stone and old wood and, faintly, something she couldn't name for a moment, and then could. Linseed oil. The smell of oiled wood, of someone tending surfaces carefully. She stood in the doorway. It wasn't dusty. That was the first thing. A house closed up for years should carry dust the way old spaces carry silence, heavily, completely. But the hallway was clean. The windowsill was clear. She touched the wooden banister on the narrow stair and her fingers came away without gray. Someone had been here. Not long ago. Someone had been here and cleaned. She moved carefully, the way you move in a place where you're not certain of your right to be present, even when the key in your hand says otherwise. The front room was small, with 2 chairs facing the window, different chairs, mismatched in the way of things chosen separately and brought together, and between them, a low table with a lamp. The lamp was plugged in. She switched it on. It worked. There were books on a shelf along the wall, familiar titles, some of them. She'd given Bernard a copy of The Remains of the Day for their 25th anniversary. Here it was. On this shelf. In this house she'd never known existed. She took the book down and opened it. On the inside cover, in Bernard's careful, slightly cramped handwriting, "For when you need somewhere quiet. B." She read it twice. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn a stone, looking for what's underneath. "For when you need somewhere quiet." She set it down gently on the chair and kept moving. The kitchen was as clean as the hallway, small and practical, with a window that looked out on the garden and a kettle on the counter. In the refrigerator, which was switched off and empty, she found nothing. In the cupboard above the stove, she found tea bags, a jar of instant coffee, 2 tins of soup, a box of crackers. Emergency provisions. The provisions of someone expecting someone else to arrive. In the bedroom upstairs, reached by the narrow stair, through the low door of the dormer room, she found a bed with a good mattress, a quilt folded across the foot. A bedside table with a reading lamp and a small stack of books, and a notepad. She opened the notepad. Bernard's handwriting again. But not a note, a list. A list of repairs completed, dated across the years. Roof tiles replaced, September 2007. Damp proofing south wall, March 2011. New boiler, January 2016. Garden wall repointed, August 2019. And on the last page, undated, new kettle. Curtains washed. Mattress replaced. Key with G. Finch upon my death. She sat on the edge of the bed. She sat there for a very long time. There was a woman next door being a relative term when the houses were separated by a shared stone wall and a considerable amount of overgrown hedge, who came out while Eleanor was standing in the garden, trying to understand what she was looking at. She was perhaps 70, with short white hair and the kind of face that has spent most of its life outdoors, weathered in a way that reads as honest rather than aged. She was carrying a pair of garden shears and regarding Eleanor with the calm assessment of someone who has been waiting for exactly this arrival, without knowing when it would come. "You'll be Eleanor," she said. It wasn't a question. "I will," Eleanor said. The woman's name was Dottie Pierce. She had lived next door to Bernard's house for 26 years. She had known Bernard for all of them. They sat in Dottie's kitchen and drank tea, and Eleanor asked the questions she had been turning over since she first opened that front door, and Dottie answered them in the straight, unhurried way of someone telling the truth without decoration. Bernard had come to Brinsham first in the early 90s, looking at the property. Dottie hadn't known him then, but she'd heard from the previous neighbor, old Ted Barker. Gone now, that a quiet man in a grey coat had stood in front of the stone house for nearly half an hour before going inside with the estate agent. And then bought it, cash, which in that village at that time was the kind of thing people noticed and respected without necessarily discussing. He'd come every few months, at first. Working on it, Dottie said. Doing things himself when he could, hiring local men when he couldn't. Always alone. Always quiet. Polite, she said, as though that were the most important thing, and perhaps, Eleanor thought, in certain kinds of loneliness it was. "He told me about you," Dottie said, with a careful look. "Not everything. Bernard wasn't the type for everything. But he said you had a hard time of it when you were young. Before the marriage. He said you'd never had a place that was just yours. That felt safe without needing anything from you in return." Eleanor looked at her tea. She knew what Bernard meant. She had grown up in a house that demanded constant management, her mother's illness, her father's silences. The particular exhausting vigilance of a child who learns early that peace must be maintained rather than assumed. She had told Bernard about it only once, early in their marriage, lying in the dark in the way people sometimes tell the true things. She hadn't thought he'd carried it the way he apparently had. He said he wanted you to have somewhere, Dottie continued. If you ever needed it. Somewhere that was yours. That no one else had a claim on. She paused, then, he used to say, Dottie, she'll never use it while I'm here. But one day she might need it. And he wanted to make sure it was ready. Eleanor set down her teacup. Outside Dottie's window, the October garden was going amber and gold, the trees beginning their annual, unhurried surrender. A blackbird moved through the hedge with no particular urgency. He never told me, Eleanor said. Not as an accusation. As a fact she was still learning the shape of. No, Dottie said. He said if he told you, you'd worry about the cost. Or tell him it was too much. Or feel like you owed him something. A small pause. He said you were very good at feeling like you owed people things. Eleanor almost laughed. It came out as something less than that, something quieter, the sound a person makes when they recognize themselves completely in a sentence and aren't certain whether to be moved or undone. That sounds like him, she said. She stayed in Brinsham that night. She hadn't planned to. She'd driven up with no bag, no overnight things, operating on the vague assumption that she would look at the house and return home by afternoon. But the afternoon moved into evening while she sat in Dottie's kitchen and then walked back through the garden of the stone house in the lowering light. And by the time she unlocked the front door a second time the sky was the deep blue of early dark and she didn't want to drive. Or perhaps she didn't want to leave yet. She wasn't sure, those were different things. There were spare towels in the bathroom cupboard, fresh ones, still in their packaging from wherever Bernard had bought them. A wrapped bar of soap. Shampoo. She stood in front of the cupboard and looked at these things he'd stocked for her and felt the particular weight of care that arrives too late to be received in person. She made soup from one of the tins in the cupboard and ate it at the small kitchen table, watching the darkness in the garden and thinking about the word ready. He had kept it ready. 31 years of readiness, of roof tiles and damp proofing and clean curtains and fresh towels. 31 years of maintaining a space he believed she might one day need, without ever placing that maintenance in front of her as a gift or a debt or a reason to feel anything in particular. He had just done it. Quietly. Alongside everything else. She thought about all the things that had filled those 31 years. Their daughter's childhood, her marriage, the grandchildren arriving in their own time. Bernard's retirement. The garden they'd made together at home, the holidays they'd taken, the evenings watching programs they half followed and discussing the news and doing the crossword badly together. All of that life, enormous and ordinary and theirs, and running alongside it, quietly, without drama, this house. This kettle. This rose on the front wall that someone had planted and trained and left to grow freely, red against gray stone. She thought about what Dottie had said. A place that was yours. That felt safe without needing anything from you in return. She had never known she was still carrying that. The old vigilance. The old calculation of what each space cost to inhabit. She had thought, she had genuinely believed, that marriage had given her that safety so completely that she'd stopped needing to think about it. And perhaps it had. Perhaps that was true. But Bernard had known, in the way that people who love very quietly and very carefully sometimes know, that safety which depends entirely on another person's presence is still a kind of borrowing. He had wanted her to have something that couldn't be lost when he was. She sat at the small kitchen table for a long time. Then she went upstairs, to the dormer room with the low ceiling and the good mattress and the quilt folded at the foot. And she made the bed with the quiet efficiency of someone who has made beds all their life, and she lay down. The room was very still. Through the single window she could see a rectangle of night sky, clear now, with the faint scattered presence of stars. She thought about Bernard at 32, trying not to smile too fully in the registry office. She thought about the note inside the remains of the day, for when you need somewhere quiet. She thought about 31 years. And she slept. Better than she had since before he died. She drove home the following morning in pale autumn sunlight, the kind that falls at an angle and makes ordinary things, a hedgerow, a petrol station, a roundabout, look briefly unexpectedly beautiful. She stopped for coffee at a small cafe in a market town she passed through, and she sat at a table by the window and let herself think clearly for the first time in weeks. The grief was still present, it would be, she understood now, for a very long time, perhaps always. In the way that 40 years of shared life doesn't simply conclude but transforms into something you carry differently. But alongside it there was something else. Something she was still finding the word for. She thought about calling her daughter, Patricia, who lived in Edinburgh and had been calling every other day with the careful, worried kindness of someone watching their mother from too far away. She would tell Patricia about Brincham. She thought about how that conversation would go, the surprise, the questions, the dad did what. And she found, unexpectedly, that she was looking forward to it. Not because it would resolve anything, but because it was a new thing to share. A new piece of Bernard to bring forward. That was the unexpected shape of it, she realized. She had driven to Brincham expecting to find something that would raise questions she didn't want to answer, a secret life, a complication, some shadow across the years. That was what the rational part of her had prepared for, even while the larger part had simply felt curious. Instead she had found something that required no revision of the past. No rereading of the years with suspicion. The house didn't change anything about the marriage, it confirmed it. Confirmed it in the particular, private language that Bernard had always spoken, not loudly, not with ceremony, not in any way that asked to be witnessed or acknowledged. He had loved her by preparing for her absence. She turned that over in her mind the way you turn something fragile, carefully, making sure you're holding it right. He had known, had always known, in the deep intuitive way of someone paying very close attention, that she had lived her whole life one step ahead of the next loss. That she had built their life together with one hand always slightly braced. Not because she doubted him. Not because she doubted the marriage. But because the body learns certain things early and does not unlearn them simply because the conditions improve. And so he had done what she could not do for herself. He had built her a floor. Not a grand gesture. Not a rescue. A floor, something to stand on when the thing she had been standing on all her life was no longer there. Something that said, without requiring her to receive it consciously, you will not fall all the way through. Eleanor paid for her coffee and walked back to the car. She sat for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the market town going about its morning, a woman pushing a pram, a man unloading boxes from a van. A child crouching to look at something on the pavement that no adult had noticed. The ordinary astonishing life of the world, continuing. She thought of something Bernard had said, years ago, decades, probably, she couldn't place it exactly. They had been talking about something inconsequential, one of those conversations that exists only in the soft middle of long marriages, and he had said, she couldn't remember the context. Only the sentence, I just want to make sure the things I do last longer than the doing of them. She had smiled and said something light in return and moved on. She remembered it now. She started the car. She pulled out onto the road, heading south, back to the house she knew, carrying inside her the knowledge of the house she hadn't. She would go back to Brincham. She knew that now. Not immediately. Not to escape anything. But in the way you return to something that belongs to you, gradually, on your own terms, in your own time. She thought about the rose on the front wall. Deep red. Still holding on. The kind that needs very little management once it's established, that grows along whatever's given to it and finds its own way into light. Bernard would have chosen that deliberately. Of course he would have. There is a particular kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with words or grand moments or the clear language of declaration. It moves alongside the visible life like a quiet current, underneath ordinary Tuesdays and crosswords done badly and cups of tea where the steam rises and curls away before anyone notices. It works in the background of a life, patient and consistent, asking nothing in return except the chance to continue. We speak often about the loves that are loud, that are witnessed, that leave records in photographs and celebrations and things said at the right moment. But there is another kind, older, perhaps, or simply quieter, that leaves its record in a different place. In a roof tile replaced. In a mattress chosen with care. In a note written inside the cover of a book and left to be found by someone who would know, when they needed to, exactly what it meant. Eleanor Marsh had been married for 40 years. She had stood in a solicitor's office and heard the word nothing shaped between the lines of a man's careful, apologetic sentences. And she had driven 40 miles north to a village she'd never heard of, and she had unlocked a door with a key left for precisely this moment, and she had found, not wealth, not rescue. Not a plot twist, but the specific, patient, 31-year answer to a question she had never known she was asking. Will there be somewhere for me? He had answered it without being asked. He had answered it in stone and linseed oil and late red roses and a shelf of books she might need and a kettle that worked and curtains that were clean. Perhaps that is what endures. Not the life we build together, which is always, eventually, subject to time, but the small, invisible preparations made for the life that continues after. Not love as a presence. Love as a floor. How much do we carry without knowing it, and how often does someone quietly build the ground beneath our feet, long before we ever need to look down?